All right, welcome to our roundtable. We'll be talking about teaching and a variety of presumptions, adaptations, and long-term opportunities that this group has unearthed as part of teaching during the pandemic in 2020 and 2021. My name is Lindsay Grace. I'm Night Chair in Interactive Media at the University of Miami and Vice President of the Higher Education Video Game Alliance. I've written a variety of things on social impact games and meaningful play over the years, most notably a book called Doing Things with Games, which is focused on social impact. And I also teach a variety of courses that are focused on social impact games at the University of Miami, which is a private institution with a variety of students from lots of disciplines and lots of aspirations beyond games. I'm going to move it over to Leanne, who's going to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm Leanne Tran, currently Assistant Professor of Games and Design at DePaul University. During the beginning of the pandemic, I was actually at University of Miami overlapping with Lindsay Grace. And in January 2021, started at DePaul University and have taught both social impact and regular and general game design at both institutions. So I'll compare and contrast my experience transitioning and teaching at both institutions during a pandemic and the differences between both being private universities, but different scale of programs and class size, and moving completely online for the last few months.
Great. Michael.
Hi, thank you everybody for joining us this evening. My name is Michael Deanda. I am a professional lecturer at DePaul University, where I teach in the game design program and co-chair the human-centered design program. My research and design focus intersects at queerness and games and Latinidad. Yep, I teach both game design and games with purpose at DePaul.
Great. Cody.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us. My name is Cody Meir. I'm Assistant Professor of Game Studies at the University of Buffalo State University of New York. There I teach courses in both game design and game studies. So I teach a class called Games, Gender, and Culture that's looking at like games, cultures, and gender in games. I'm also co-director of the Paula Light Lab at UB, which is a lab that looks at queer, trans, and feminist digital media. And to give just a little context about University of Buffalo, it is a larger public research university of 30,000 students, and we have a lot of commuter students, students from New York City, and students in Western New York. But yeah, so thank you for coming.
Great, thank you. And Wendy.
Sugalis Wagweku, Dr. Wendy Sierra ni Yugyats, Anaya Deaga ni Nawal Niwagita Lod. So hello everyone, my name is Dr. Wendy Sierra. I'm a member of the Oneida Nation, part of the Turtle Clan. I primarily make games with my tribe, so I'm the designer of A Strong Fire, an Oneida language and culture game that you can find at astrongfire.com. I've also worked on some little apps, 80 words and phrases in Ukwayawena, which is our word for our language. And I'm also working on a 80 words and phrases app for the Wichita tribe. I am currently an assistant professor of game studies in the Honors College at TCU, which is a private university in the Big 12, as they remind you often. About 10,000 undergraduate students. And like Leanne, I spent the first part of the pandemic at a different school. So I was at St. John Fisher College in Rochester, New York, which is a small liberal arts college, about 2,500 students. In that position, I was teaching English and also doing some teaching game design, primarily through Unity and C#. But now I'm teaching primarily cultural analysis through games, so video games and representation, that type of thing.
Great. Thank you. One of the things I think it would be useful to just sort of lay out for everyone is what we sort of, from our perspective, especially when we're talking about both teaching it and doing the research, what we mean by sort of games for change or social impact games in this context. I'll let someone else start.
I'll pop in. Oh,
Go for it.
Sure. So as I mentioned, a lot of my work is around language preservation, right? And so when I think about games for change, I'm predominantly focusing on my perspective as a designer and the change that I want to see, which is the perseverance of our culture and our language. So that's what I work on, and doing that work with the community and engaging my community and bringing us all toward the work together.
Great. That was a nice, succinct definition. Thank you. Leanne, I think you were going to hop in.
Sure. So I consider myself a social impact designer, where games is one of the mediums that I use. So I also practice human-centered design, do a lot of co-design with subject matter experts, or what I like to call client partners. And there's in games we talk about tandem, transformational game design. So a lot of those techniques I've applied even before we had that kind of label. But often I work with existing content that I learn about. I learn through my subject matter experts how to distill that and abstract it into playful interactive systems, oftentimes games. Tabletop has been a big, I've created a lot of tabletop games as well as digital experiences. And I find it really important when you're teaching students to understand that, the world is made up of systems, and we can distill that into games, whether they be for entertainment purposes, for communicating a message, or advocating for a social issue.
Great. I think one of the ways to maybe sum it up from what I'm hearing is also generally this sort of games at the intersection of some kind of sociological interest or educational interest. So helping people learn languages. I know with my work, it tends to be things like helping students do news games, helping students do sort of like documentary games, all these sort of things that intersect with games with some version of a mission or purpose. Excellent. Michael?
I think it's also important to pay attention to games that maybe not necessarily engage with the systemic or sociological issue itself, but also are meant to raise funds for some kind of research or community-based support. So my research broadly focuses on the LGBTQ community. I'm specifically focused on HIV as an issue that is systemic and political. And Drag Bingo itself was developed to address the HIV crisis coming out of the 80s.
It's a great point.
I think I really like that you brought that up, Michael, especially the community aspect, and that game design is an important part of sort of what I teach and the work that I do too. When I think about games with change, I really want to think about empowering my students, and not just as designers, but also as game players, as members of their own gaming communities, right? I want them to better understand the issues that are running through game cultures, and then how they can intervene in them, right? So the community sort of focus, empowering them to become actors there is really important in my own teaching and work too.
Great. I like Wendy's gesture. In short, I think it's an interesting thing to say, great, here's what we are interested in doing both in the classroom and as part of our research/practice. Can each of you describe the environment in which you had to meet these goals in the middle of a pandemic? So for me, for example, our institution went mid-year and decided we were going to do some version of a hybridization. We're going to teach some things online, some things not. Ultimately, I decided to do what we call an asynchronous environment with 1 hour a week of synchronous interaction. And I also had to deal with a population of both grad students who may have been much more comfortable with independent work, and almost first-year undergraduates who are still just getting themselves oriented and learning how to do their own laundry. So it's kind of fun to think about. We have these really big goals, like helping people understand cultures for which they have no experience, at the same time that we have these basic pedagogic goals, like can they implement something in Unity? So it'd be great if you guys could kind of give us some situation, help us understand what you did broadly, and then help us understand where you, I know I was largely teaching design and development, but others may have been teaching game studies and analysis. That'll help us with some of our conversation.
I can jump in. So I was teaching actually both at the same time. I had a game design course and a game sort of studies and analysis course, and I had already been using Discord. We had been using Discord as sort of a supplement to the class when the pandemic hit, and so it quickly became okay, well, the supplement is now where the main thing is, right? The main show is now happening here, and that kind of, luckily, I think that eased the transition for the students, and that they, they were already at least somewhat active on, the shared space, and they could like migrate there. So I think that really helped a lot, and it led to sort of one of, for me, the biggest sort of outcomes of the teaching too, is that it really struck home to me. And I know I just mentioned community in the last answer too, but just the importance of community, right? Like, I kept hearing from students as they were dealing with issues like, I like that we're doing our classes over Discord because it also gives me a sense of community, right? Like, if I'm really struggling with something, I've got people to reach out to. If I just want to play a game with a classmate, we've got a space where we can meet up and do that, right? And I think that really helped a lot.
Great. Others?
I just want to say that I'm not a freshman, and I feel like I might still be figuring out how to do my laundry. Like, I know that there are different temperature settings, but what they actually mean, I'm not sure, or why you would use them. So at TCU, we were given the option to teach fully in person, fully in person, you still had to have your class broadcast so that anybody that wanted to take it online could, or to do, I don't know. They had like 3 different options that included that. And then the last option was online. I picked online. I'm not even sure the distinction between some of the other 3. And they mandated that if you taught online, you had to meet synchronously for at least 80% of your class time. I think if I had not had that rule, I would have leaned more into something like what Lindsay did, which is a lot of asynchronous stuff, and then one sort of succinct, we're all on the same page, we still know what each other look like, right? Type of meeting. But because of that 80% rule, and I think because I was new and like maybe not as feisty as I normally am, we did a lot. We also did some Discord. We used Minecraft EDU as a class space a lot, which was really interesting and fun, and they responded really well too. And then we used Zoom and Google Docs a lot, and I can respond more about those and other stuff. I also have all undergrads, and because I'm in the honors college, I'm teaching all cultural studies type classes. And I don't want to call on Michael, but I know that he taught, I think you taught Unity, right?
Yeah, not that first quarter, but yeah.
I'd love to hear how that went.
Yeah, so the announcements of lockdown happened right as we were wrapping up. So it depends on quarters. We have a large number of first generation college students, as well as a large number of Black and brown students as well. And in School of Design specifically, our report shows that about 51% of students report being LGBTQ or identifying as LGBTQ in some contexts, which is a lot. And like COVID kind of compounded that in like very strange ways. The issues that kind of come with that. We were forced to move online during the final week of one quarter, and then we had a week over spring break to figure out how to teach classes online for the full next quarter. So one of the things to keep in mind is that what I hear is that a lot of people moved mid-semester into online-only spaces. And one of the things that I was challenged with is that I didn't have that kind of repertoire with the students that I was teaching in the spring quarter that a lot of people already had developed. And so like for me, it was like coming in, not knowing any of the students. And I was teaching 3 classes. One was a fundamentals, one was a playtesting class, which was a nightmare to figure out how to teach online. Because I just revamped that in the previous quarter, and that was a very co-located, watching people doing fishbowls for playtesting and like talking about playtesting methods. And then the last one was Games with a Purpose, which is a combined graduate, MFA, and undergraduate course that has some weirdly unique positions for each of them. And one of the things that is weird about what Leanne and I kind of differ is our positions at the university come with like weird kind kind of access things. So DePaul offered like online training for online teaching. However, for like assistant professors or tenure track or tenured professors, they got to retain the IP of the materials that they developed for the class. For professional lecturers or term faculty, they kept the IP. And that is, I don't know if you've read Naomi Klein's shock doctrine, it felt really that. So I went into this new quarter, not knowing the students that I was teaching, kind of figuring out on the fly how to teach 3 courses, all online, and like just trying to run with it in a context that I didn't know what my university was maintaining IP of the things that I developed and what it was not. And like that just felt really awkward and icky, and yeah, that's where I came in.
I'm going to let Leanne hop in, but I do want to say that you're trying to keep it succinct just with Broadview first, that I think the next question should definitely be questions around equity and access, because we all had a lot of experiences, and that's actually an equity access challenge on the faculty side where we largely talked about students. So Leanne, could you give us your broad view, your broad situation?
Sure, and I can kind of connect all of these things because, as I said, I started at University of Miami, where Lindsay is, and I'm now with Mike at DePaul. So I was on the semester system in 2020, so we all broke for spring break, and there was momentum because they had already been together for 7 or 8 weeks, and then it all kind of fell apart because actually, I don't know if Lindsay said this, but the university kind of suggested we would all be coming back after spring break, and in the middle of spring break said, don't come back. So there was a lot of scrambling. Students had left computers and resources in Miami if they had left to go wherever they had made plans. So it was very complicated, and you just have to be very flexible to those situations. I know some people had less access to even internet, so that was challenging. I had at least one person, I think, calling from their phone. So, you know, there's a lot of flexibility on the fly, but at least they're kind of speaking to something that Mike said, is that the students knew each other, they knew me. Many of them were repeat students, so I was very lucky in a small class to know the students very well, and they were very, generally speaking, very open to sharing, you know, what their situation was. We just kind of worked with it, and we just got through. And they were all graduating, both had graduate and undergraduate students, but they were all class of 2020, and they were just trying to finish. So we maintained trying to do as much synchronous as we could manage, but it was mostly asynchronous at that point. There were 2 student teams, and so they had to coordinate, which I think was challenging for them because they were all in different situations in life and moving and everything. And then the next time and then I switched to DePaul, where they were completely online, and I was new to the institution, but we had, you know, many months of kind of practice, even if they were a first-year student, you know, they likely had a class online already. And I found that, you know, using Discord was really helpful. The students actually took ownership of that, so they really ran that and created the channels, and they were really good about, again, working in teams in that class in my Games with Purpose course, and coordinating via the chat, and very, very much, you know, creating community there, as well as through the kind of accidental, as Colleen would call them, accidental games, games for change. I played some kind of more social games that created, you know, icebreakers and allowed them to connect as a class, as well as within their teams towards, you know, ideating and brainstorming, and then eventually play testing. I will say that the first class of the University of Miami group, it was very awkward, but we did the whole Zoom thing where they had a tabletop game. If they had known they were going to be doing this remotely, they might have made a tabletop game. We did the Zoom camera, very crude pieces, and we just did it. Like, it was very cumbersome, but we had to play test, and that's what we did. I think there were like bottle caps, those game pieces.
Great. So I think this is a good way to sort of transition to some of the observations that I think generally many people have learned over the years about, like, sort of the advantages of synchronous versus the disadvantages. I know that, you know, for me personally, there was a lot of consideration around allowing students who had jobs to actually go to those jobs, to do things like care for loved ones and do the other work of getting from wherever they were. University of Miami has a large foreign population, a large international population. So there are a lot of people who are were just trying to get home and didn't know how that was going to look. And then later we're on a 12-hour time difference trying to drop into a course. And so we kind of, I think a lot of those may be obvious, but we may want to share some of those observations, why it's nice to have an asynchronous class and why building community in a synchronous class is also beneficial and helpful. But also, if people could kind of talk about things like the intellectual property issue came up, how much of your content were you developing and how much did you keep? And also just general accessibility. Like I know I used Google Jamboard as my substitute for whiteboards, but I don't know if other people have other solutions. Let's chat about it.
I think Wendy mentioned it already, but I think many of us have probably used other, like the Google Drive, Google Suite. Being able to collaborate and see live what people are doing was really helpful. So any kind of version of that. So lots of, I was already recommending Google Docs for collaborative work to students, but it was very much almost like required or, more compulsory given the pandemic.
Yeah, I wasn't aware of
I think that. Okay, I was gonna say, I think that it constrained my choice on what games I was willing to assign a little bit, because again, teaching like cultural studies type courses, game studies, had we been in person, I could have brought my consoles and fired up our computer. And since I knew students were gonna be mostly playing at home on their own, is this on Steam and Mac? Is it on Android and iOS? Like, can I get this on every available platform? And I also very carefully considered the price point of the games that I was assigning in a way that I would not have otherwise. Because again, I could bring my copies or I could bring the school copies. And then I also thought a lot more about technological literacy. I feel very confident that I can teach you to play just about any game if we're sitting next to each other and I'm showing you what to do. I feel less confident at how I can describe things on Zoom, and also the level of frustration that you're going to get to before you reach out and ask me for help, right? So those were some big considerations that, and not that they're not relevant in my in-person classes, I do still think about those types of things, but they became much, much more important thinking about the fact that students would be acquiring these things on their own and playing them on their own.
It's an interesting observation and a good perhaps heuristic so people who are listening get a sense for like, what can I do in the future? I don't know if any of you involved your library, because libraries are very good at saying, we have a catalog of film. Can we have a catalog of games that the students can validate? I don't know if anyone did anything like that. Are there other solutions that people had sort of discovered mid-semester and gone, aha? I think Wendy and Leanne had both mentioned repositories of game collections and HTML5. If you want to, at the least, maybe drop those in the chat, that might be really handy, and mention them now. I think people would love to know what you used.
Regarding teaching games with a purpose, that first quarter, that was also when Adobe stopped supporting Flash. And so a lot of the games that I had in mind for that course were just not available. And so like in the week that I had to figure out what to do, I turned to itch.io as a source of like looking up things that people were making. And like, there's a good amount of games on there. Some are well designed, some are they need work, but like, then that kind of invited different conversations. Like, what is this game trying to address? Or what is the designer trying to address through this game? And like, what are some of the like strengths of it? And like, where could it be better? And so like, it was about shifting the conversation about like what you're playing. That was one of the ways that I kind of addressed that.
I think one of the great discussions we had earlier that I think leads right into this is this idea of meeting students where they are. So we kind of typically talk about technographics. Do they have the required hardware? Demographics, does this make sense to someone without the context that I can't provide them? And then sort of psychographics, does doing, a game about pandemics seem like the right thing to do during a pandemic? And so if you guys have thoughts on, I know you do, on meeting people where they are and sort of adapting to their needs, it's a great time to chat about some of that.
Yeah, I'm trying to sort of put together like the question about access and what you had just raised, Lindsay, too. In that, I think I posted this in the chat just a moment ago, but like one of the biggest things that like I really felt was ethically necessary. Going online and going to teaching on Discord was being as flexible as possible with my students, right? And one of the things I loved about Discord is, I think it was Judith had posted in the chat about having students dial in from phones. And I had experienced that in a much bigger way going online in the pandemic. I had students who didn't have great internet access. And so they were able to follow along on the course, at least, even if they couldn't always say or post things to the Discord, they could follow along on Discord, and it increased access in that way. But I also, I really leaned into having conversations with my students about access in things that became less accessible, like Flash games that Michael brought up, right? One of the games that I teach really often is Anna Anthropy's Dysphoria, which is a game that became less and less available through the years because Anna Anthropy didn't want it to be sort of widely accessible. But then when Flash was no longer supported, it just broke, right? And so my students and I, we looked at that, we talked about that with each other, right? And it led to this really great conversation about well, should you always be able to access everything, right? Should things always be available to you? Or are there good reasons why things might not be accessible to you? And so it led to these really great conversations about access and equity that I think we were all sort of living in the midst of with the pandemic too, as we took these online classes.
One of you had the note that I think is definitely worth sharing, which is this idea that the value of streaming with students actively for situations where you might have a copy and they don't, or they may have a copy or they could share it. Does anyone want to talk about their experience doing that? I thought that was a really smart idea.
I used Jackbox games, both in my games for the purpose, games for change courses, and those as well. And I found that, I kind of already said this, but Colleen gave I think it was a keynote actually on accidental games for change. And I found that Hey Robot, and at the time I used I think it's called Live Water from Jackbox, because it allows for more than up to 100 players, right? So a lot of things with some of these games is that you can only have so many synchronous players. And I've actually found that, again, it was the icebreaker creating community, but even in the case of, in both of those, actually, they're kind of almost like trivia games. So you are learning, and it was interesting to see what people, got right and didn't get right. And not because it was about intelligence, it's more of just how random are these things that we're trying to get, say, a smart, like Alexa or Google Home to repeat for the prompt, or can we suss out what's the correct answer to this kind of random amusement park category. So I found that was really useful. And then a game I often play in my intro to game design class is Keep Talking, Nobody Explodes, because I use Colleen Macklin and John Sharp's book, Game Design and Play. And I think it's a great example of kinds of play, because I could say you can almost argue that all the kinds of play are present in that game. And so in the classroom, I have it on Steam, I would load it up, and students would take turns walking up to the computer and playing the diffuser. So the person who has to, actually use the controls and try to solve the puzzle, basically. And we tried to do it over Zoom, and I had never used remote control, at least as the host. And that was people complained about it, but I think we were successful in that we got it to work, period. But it was very awkward. There was a little bit of lag, and it was a time-based game. So students got slightly frustrated because it wasn't as responsive. But I actually found that the fact that we were able to do it and that we have had this experience was actually that was a success, right? So that we can play a game like that over remote control with, some adjustments.
I think this is a good point to bring up one of the themes that we had discussed prior, which is this idea that we're kind of, besides meeting students where they are, we're also dealing with a sort of a clash of cultures. So there's institutional demands on what platforms, learning management systems you're supposed to use, and then the reality, particularly a technical reality. So we heard itch, we heard Discord, and at some institutions this is a restriction where you've got to be really careful because of FERPA rules or rules around what, at least in the US, are appropriate things that you can share across these spaces. Does anybody have any experience in that they want to share? Or the other one that might kind of prompt a really, because we had a lot of great discussions about this, is this idea, for example, that many of the students were already on Discord if they were active gamers, and it was a very comfortable space for them. And one of the things that I think many of us were tasked with as part of teaching during this time was the care work that also goes into working with students. So doing a little more counseling, more support. I mean, we're largely focusing on the pandemic, but this was also a year with substantial activity politically, a lot of pressures and a lot of personal loss. There's a lot of reliance on faculty, even in fun and whimsical spaces like games, to give people support. So I don't know if there's any intersection with some of the tech you used and how easy it was to give that support, or thoughts about your role as an educator / counselor.
I know when I did Discord, I definitely found myself, I delinked it from games so that students couldn't tell how much time I spent in World of Warcraft, especially in the fall when the new expansion was out. And I was sort of, would have myself like intentionally set to offline when I write, to try to do some of that sort of carving out some space. And I think that my hesitancy initially in even using Discord was that I do use this space personally, right? Chat with my daddy on Discord, chat with my guild on Discord. My husband and I use Discord more than we text, right? Like, so it's a space that's very associated with my personal sphere for me. And so I wanted to be sure that if I were to use it for a class, that I would be able to draw some lines around my accessibility. But at the end of the day, the thing is, I'm a sucker for when I hear that notification, right? And I don't check my email at 10 p.m., but I definitely responded to Discord messages from students at 10 p.m. And so it was sort of this, like, I tried to not make myself visible, but at the same time, if a student reached out, I couldn't not respond. And I think that that's a constant tension. And I do think that, at least in my experience as the fun professor, and potentially as a female professor, and as someone that they at least think is younger, when in reality I'm old and dead inside, I think that I get those reach outs more than some of the other faculty members, right? So yeah.
I think a couple of us have talked about our own stresses in the middle of this as well.
Yeah, I would really echo what you said about checking your visibility settings. Like, one of the things that I kind of wish I had done in retrospect is maybe like made a different sort of Discord account for sort of like my teaching and professional sort of stuff.
Your mic is breaking up, but I think I can translate to one of the things you wish you did was make a different Discord account so that you could keep the two lives separate. Does that sound right? I want to leave enough space for the audience to ask questions. And so I think this might be a good spot. If you were to sort of say one thing, one takeaway from this, this challenging year of teaching, what would it be? And I'll buy you some time by giving, I think, one of my observations, which is ultimately the world is changing, and I live in a place that is very strongly affected by climate change. And so the thing that I think I distinctly learned was how to not just adapt, but to do things like how to better build community, how to detach myself from the classroom as the only learning space, how to incorporate things like pervasive learning and encourage students to go out, do something on their time and then reconvene. And also this high intensity meeting. So I didn't have the luxury of 3 to 6 hours a week. I had the luxury of 45 to 50 minutes, which is grueling sometimes in front of a camera. And so a lot of that, I think that the big takeaway for me is that I was forced into practicing a skill set as an educator that I am going to have to apply every time we close for a hurricane, or in other parts of the world, snowstorm, or your local whatever.
I think that is a great point, that we've all learned. To a certain extent, everyone's, gotten better, at least maybe, for doing things online and both synchronously and asynchronously. So in these, more kind of emergency situations, we can depend on that. I would say that for me, Lindsay mentioning beyond the kind of traditional classroom or course, I was running, co-directing a lab at the University of Miami called Nerd Lab. I'm now restructuring something at DePaul. But a lot of my engagement with students was through the lab, doing collaborative work, some of it faculty driven, some of it student driven, some of them being more socially, racial justice. Obviously, there was a huge movement and in the middle of the pandemic, and students really wanting to have a voice and using play and interactivity for that. And so being able to support them in that space. I was actually residential faculty while I was in Miami. And so also, being there, but not being there when I was literally physically on campus and being, kind of a sounding board for them, but as a professor who was not their educator, so to speak, in the educator role. And then moving to DePaul and providing, kind of professional experience in the classroom. So we did have a lot of synchronous time where we were talking about, playing games, talking about games, but often the students were breaking out, whether it was during class time or a time they scheduled themselves to work as a small team in kind of a semi-professional context, right? So we'd have a producer and a game dev lead. Everyone was working together as designers, brainstorming and making decisions. And I think that, gave them, for many of them, that was a leg up to say that they had this semi-professional experience working for a client on a very specific design brief. And, I have another group now getting funding from DePaul to create a social impact game called Impact Grants. I know Mike has another team doing that, another project. And so I think that we are supporting students, but it goes beyond the traditional classroom. And that some of these lessons we've learned can apply, going online in emergencies for classrooms, but also for other uses too.
Many of them are going to be freelancing for a company in Brazil and living in LA. Like, that is the future. And I think that's one of the hints that we're in virtual conference number 2 for Games for Change. So yeah.
I know so many people who are now just completely remote now,
Yep. Miami is full of people who work here and live here and don't work here. Great. Others? Quick takeaway?
Jamboard is great for a lot of people collaborating on like a document, for brainstorming, thought mapping, all of that. And the further into the pandemic we went, the more students actually really loved it.
+1 for that, for sure. Wendy, Cody?
Yeah, I think that it just, going back to the idea of thinking specifically about teaching with games in a pandemic, it really made me get a lot more critical about the play experience and how the play experience would enhance the other things going on. And that doesn't mean that I always chose community building things, right? Like sometimes we had really heavy group work weeks. And so I was intentionally giving them a single player game that they could play in pairs or online if they wanted, but they could also sort of pull away and do their own thing for a minute if they wanted. And then sometimes I knew that we had some really heavy individual work coming up. And so I tried when possible to foreground community games. And I think that hadn't previously been as big a part of my sort of game selection heuristic because I depended on in-class interaction to do most of that work, and then the games could just do the course objectives, right? So it sort of flipped how I thought about choosing games.
Great. And Cody?
Is my mic working?
You're great.
Okay, glorious day. I would say that like the thing that I took away from the pandemic teaching experience was really to have a plan for, and I think this goes back to some of the last questions we dealt with, like community care. So like not just having a plan in terms of like, oh, if we have to go online, what does that look like? What do we do technology wise? What do we do platform wise? But really focusing on what we do community wise, like, and how we have both sort of like ground rules for our class, that we have a community of care, but then also having students create sort of their own individual plans for what does this work look like? Like, what does your path forward look like? And to make this really like concrete and wrap it up, like I have my students like actually like sit down and write plans for how they engage with their online communities, right? Like, so what they will do in certain situations and stuff like that. And I found that to be a really great classroom activity that gets them thinking about this and planning for it.
I found myself, and it's a theme I'm hearing, I found myself thinking about how to structurally flip the classroom so that the students were more comfortable in sort of leading their education, which is, I think, part of what you're mentioning here. But I also found myself happier with the experience when I too adopted a playful approach to solving the new set of challenges. So instead of going, oh my God, this is so different than what I'm used to, going, wait, what can I do that would sort of be fun? And it might not work, but that's okay. It kept me fresh in the classroom. I don't know if you guys had that same experience. Looks like we got some D&D. All right, I think this is a good time to open it up to questions. If there are questions from our audience, there's a Q&A section, or you can just drop them in chat. Otherwise, we have a lot more stuff we wanted to chat about. So if we don't get one soon, I'll hop in.
Somebody asked a question in the Q&A.
Great.
What are your favorite free accessible games you assign in your classes?
Wow, that's a really big one. So what I do personally is I've got, buying everyone some time, I have a bunch of repositories that I then just double check to make sure the game is still free. So I think Leanne may have mentioned this initiative that I did last year for news games in particular, where I've archived them. And then part of the reason for archiving them is so that people can at least see a video, because one of the problems, of course, what used to work doesn't work any longer. The other thing, I mean, it's kind of obvious here, but going to the Games for Change repository of social impact games on their website has been useful as well. But on the free side, my one challenge is a combination of quality. Sometimes it's free for a reason, but also equity. I'm often looking for HTML5 specific games, and then sometimes there's a reason that people make it free because they're going to put ads in it or all these other things. And then free may also be regional. So it's always a more complex question for me. It's like, what are you explicitly trying to do? And then I can make some recommendations on what games. But
Love Queers in Love. I've done that one a lot.
That's my favorite.
That one's fun.
It teaches so well. It's fabulous.
I added a couple there. I actually started for my games and representation course a doc, because I do get a lot of students that say they're not gamers, and that means a variety of things, like everything from, oh, I'm not a gamer, I only spend all my time playing Madden, to like literally I haven't picked up a console or anything. So there's a wide variety in there. But I started a doc, and I invited some students, like, if you have suggestions, put stuff in, and I put stuff in and tried to group it a little bit by like topic. And so I copied in When Rivers Were Trails by Elizabeth LaPonce, which is awesome. And it's sort of a Anishinaabe take on Oregon Trail. Maori Pow Wars and Migiwam Chapter 1. So Maori Pow Wars is like a tower defense type game, and then Migiwam, you play a healer putting stuff together. So those are all really cool, fun, indigenous games that are.
And Leanne dropped in the chat an oldie but goodie play spent. There's a sort of like these canon of games that broadly apply to social impact. I think that would be one of them for sure, as is many things built in Twine that we know will be accessible.
That's actually one thing I found in this past year, especially with Flash becoming obsolete, is that a lot of games are text-based. So my students did a lot of reading in their gameplay, which some were okay with that, others, less so. It's hard to find an easy to share kind of mechanics-based one that's free and not platform specific, or OS specific, so operating system specific. So every time you pick one, you're like, will it work for Mac, Windows, is it iOS? Is it, how old is it? I mean, it's just so hard to find something.
One of the things I just remembered that I found useful for students, because sometimes you need something like Second Life, is Mozilla Hubs, because it was accessible as a VR tool for my students who actually have headsets, but also totally accessible from basic PC or a Mac. It was kind of hardware agnostic, and it was they liked just being in a virtual world where they could make themselves a cat and write on a board and share a video. And I have to thank one of my colleagues, Roger Altizer, for that suggestion, but it just went off in the class. Like, students were elated, and I was shocked because it's like, we have one of these every couple of years. It used to be called Second Life. We've got a question in the last few minutes. Can you describe ways students collaborated? So I know we mentioned Jamboard and Discord, but if you have other thoughts.
I have a really quick thought. I think it actually addresses the last question and this one. One of the things that I really enjoyed, and am I coming through okay? People can hear me good? Is my mic working?
Yep, you're fine.
Great. Is using streaming to increase accessibility to things. Like, so if there was a game that was relatively popular that I could expect like a good number of the students in the class to have, that we would stream and play that together, and I wouldn't require everyone to buy it, because that's always my hesitation with mainstream games, is asking them to buy something expensive and the whole class to do that. But if we, could stream it together and have like a group of students play it as a class, that was a really great space for community building, for collaboration, for class discussion, and it like I said, it really increased the accessibility of those games. Because one of the things I really want from my students is both to broaden sort of their horizon of different games they engage with, but also to change how they engage with the popular and mainstream games they're probably playing really regularly, right? And so practicing that by streaming together really helped a lot.
Thanks.
Having students post their games on itch so that they could access each other's games and playtest them, especially for class sessions, and then tapping into streaming for that as well was useful in classes where I especially taught Unity.
It's fun when you get to put it in full context. It's like, no, you have to upload this, and you have to do everything. You have to put the images in. I taught esports this semester, or last semester. It was great because it was like, no, everything is going to be video, because you're going to have to stream this content, because this is an esports and streaming class. So it's fun when you're like, no, this is not just a technical requirement. It's how we get it done.
I'll also say that students were more active on Discord when I had other students moderate the Discord channel instead of moderating it myself. And then they were like collaborating with each other without me even asking, and like sharing code and like troubleshooting each other's code. It was great.
Great. I dropped this in the notes, but I also noticed that students liked to meet where they were already. So if they were gamers, they were on Discord. If they were like, some of my business oriented students were on Slack. And so they clustered themselves based on platform, which I wouldn't have predicted. We've got 1 minute or so left. Do people have any parting thoughts? I'd like to thank everybody for visiting and for listening to us and asking some great questions, and our panelists for being such great panelists.
Awesome. Thanks so much for coming, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you.